The morning mist clung to the memorial park like a shroud as Victoria Sterling adjusted the weight of her military dress jacket, her arthritis-gnarled fingers trembling slightly as she positioned each medal with precise care. At 81, she moved with the deliberate slowness of age, but her pale blue eyes remained sharp as winter steel, surveying the growing crowd of Veterans Day attendees with the tactical awareness of someone who had spent decades assessing potential threats. The brass caught the early sunlight despite their tarnished appearance, each decoration telling a story that Victoria had carried in silence for nearly 6 decades. Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 2 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with V device and 3 oak leaf clusters, Combat Infantryman Badge. The array would have been impressive on a career soldier's uniform, but on the chest of an elderly woman in a thrift store dress, they looked like elaborate costume jewelry to the casual observer. Sergeant First Class Dylan Reeves noticed her first, his parade ground posture rigid in dress blues that still smelled faintly of the dry cleaner's chemicals. At 26, he carried himself with the confidence of someone whose service in Afghanistan had earned him genuine respect, though nothing approaching the collection of hardware that the old woman was displaying. "Check out the medal collector over there," he murmured to his companion, Corporal Travis Hammond, a wiry young Marine whose crisp uniform reflected 2 tours in Iraq and a chest full of legitimate decorations. Hammond followed his gaze to where Victoria was settling into a folding chair in the back row, her movements careful and measured. Jesus, Purple Heart, DSC, Silver Star. What's next? The Medal of Honor? Women weren't even in combat roles when those decorations would have been earned, Reeves observed with the certainty of someone who had studied military history. Most of those medals didn't even exist for female personnel until the 1990s. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story of hidden valor intrigues you, consider subscribing for more tales of unrecognized heroes. Victoria had excellent hearing despite her age, and every word of their conversation reached her ears with crystal clarity. She had endured similar conversations for decades, the whispered doubts, the knowing looks, the assumption that an elderly woman couldn't possibly have earned decorations that most career soldiers never saw. It was a burden she had carried with stoic patience, understanding that the truth of her service would remain classified long after she was gone. The ceremony organizer, a well-meaning volunteer named Patricia Chen, approached Victoria with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think there might be some confusion about seating arrangements. The section you're in is reserved for recipients of high-level combat decorations." Victoria looked up with eyes that had seen more combat than most of the uniformed personnel present would ever experience. "I understand the seating arrangement, dear." Patricia's gaze drifted to the impressive array of medals, her expression skeptical but polite. "It's just that we need to verify. I mean, there are specific protocols for displaying military decorations, and some of these appear to be..." "Appear to be what?" Victoria asked gently, though steel edged her voice. "Well, it's unusual to see this particular combination on someone of your demographic," Patricia finished awkwardly. Hammond had drifted closer during this exchange, his Marine training making him protective of military traditions and honor. "Ma'am, I don't want to be disrespectful, but wearing decorations you didn't earn is a federal crime. It's called stolen valor." Victoria's weathered hands folded in her lap with military precision. "Young man, I'm quite familiar with the Stolen Valor Act of 2013, as well as its predecessor legislation. I'm also familiar with every regulation governing the proper wear and display of military decorations." She gestured to her medals with a slight smile. "Each of these decorations is properly positioned according to Army Regulation 672-1, with precedence ribbons arranged in correct order of importance. The oak leaf clusters are positioned precisely as specified in the regulation, and the Combat Infantryman Badge is positioned correctly above the pocket flap." The technical accuracy of her knowledge gave Hammond pause, but Reeves stepped forward with the confidence of youth challenging age. "That's information anyone could look up online," he said. "The real question is where and when you supposedly earned these decorations." Victoria's expression remained serene, though something dangerous flickered in her eyes. Southeast Asia, primarily. Some operations in Cambodia and Laos, though those were never supposed to happen officially. Cambodia and Laos? Hammond laughed outright. Lady, the United States never had official ground operations in Cambodia or Laos during Vietnam. And even if we did, women weren't serving in combat roles. You're absolutely correct on both counts, Victoria replied calmly. We weren't supposed to be there, and women weren't supposed to be in combat roles. The subtle emphasis she placed on supposed to be should have been a warning, but the young soldiers were too committed to their assumptions to recognize the distinction. Colonel Robert Hayes, the ceremony's military coordinator, had been watching the exchange from across the memorial park. At 68, he was old enough to remember when the military had been full of secrets and classified operations that never appeared in official histories. Something about the elderly woman's bearing, the way she sat with perfect military posture despite her age, the precise arrangement of her decorations, the calm confidence with which she faced challenges to her credibility, triggered recognition alarms in his experienced mind. He approached the group with measured steps, his own chest full of decorations from 32 years of distinguished service. Is there a problem here? This woman is wearing decorations she couldn't possibly have earned, Reeves explained. We were just explaining the stolen valor laws. Hayes studied Victoria's medal display with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every decoration the army could award. The combination was unusual, not impossible, but representing a level of combat service that would have been extraordinary even for male soldiers during the Vietnam era. Ma'am, he said formally, those are some very distinguished decorations. Would you mind sharing when and where you earned them? Victoria's smile was patient but held no warmth. Colonel, some operations remain classified at levels that still exist today. I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics. Classified operations, Hammond scoffed. Right. What's next? Secret agent stories. Hayes held up a hand to silence the younger man. Something in Victoria's terminology had caught his attention. The way she referred to operations rather than deployments. The casual mention of classification levels, the military bearing that seemed ingrained rather than adopted. Ma'am, if these decorations represent classified service, surely you have some form of documentation. He was interrupted by the distant sound of rotors approaching from the east. All heads turned skyward as a helicopter became visible through the morning haze, but this wasn't the civilian news chopper they might have expected to cover a small-town Veterans Day ceremony. The aircraft approaching was unmistakably military, a Black Hawk with markings that made Colonel Hayes's blood pressure spike. As it drew closer, he could make out additional aircraft following behind, creating a formation that spoke of high-level VIP transport rather than routine military business. What the hell? Reeves muttered, shading his eyes against the sun. The lead helicopter circled the memorial park once before settling into a landing pattern in the adjacent field. The crowd of Veterans Day attendees pressed forward to watch, their ceremony forgotten in the face of this unexpected military arrival. Victoria remained seated, checking her watch with the casual confidence of someone who had been expecting this interruption. Ma'am, Patricia asked nervously, do you know why military helicopters are landing at our ceremony? I have some idea, Victoria replied mildly. The Black Hawk touched down with professional precision, its rotors slowly winding down as figures emerged from the cabin. First came a security detail in dark suits, their movements crisp and professional as they established a perimeter. Then came military aides in dress uniforms, followed by a figure that made Colonel Hayes snap involuntarily to attention. General Patricia Morrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stepped down from the helicopter with the bearing of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Her 4-star uniform was immaculate, her silver hair pulled back in regulation style, her presence immediately commanding the attention of every veteran in the park. But it was the final passenger who emerged that made Hammond's jaw drop, and Reeves take an involuntary step backward. President David Richardson himself stepped down from the Black Hawk, his presence transforming the small-town Veterans Day ceremony into something approaching a state event. Secret Service agents materialized from seemingly nowhere, establishing security protocols with practiced efficiency. The crowd fell silent except for scattered whispers as the President of the United States, flanked by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, walked purposefully through the Memorial Park. Their destination was immediately clear to everyone watching. They were walking directly toward Victoria Sterling. "Ma'am," President Richardson said formally as he approached, extending his hand in greeting. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." Victoria rose from her chair with the fluid motion of someone whose military bearing remained intact despite her age. "Mr. President, this is quite unexpected. I was visiting Fort Benning this morning and heard you were attending this ceremony," Richardson replied, shaking her hand with genuine respect. "I couldn't pass up the opportunity to thank you personally for your service to this country." The gathered crowd watched in stunned silence as the President of the United States spoke with the woman they had dismissed as a fraud just minutes earlier. General Morrison stepped forward with a leather folder in her hands. "Colonel Sterling, by order of the President and with the gratitude of a nation, I am authorized to present you with decorations that have been denied recognition for far too long." "Colonel?" Hammond whispered, the word barely audible. President Richardson turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the Memorial Park. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Colonel Victoria Sterling, one of the most decorated officers in the history of the United States Army. Her service record remains largely classified even today, but I can tell you that the operations she led in Southeast Asia saved thousands of American lives and helped bring the Vietnam War to a successful conclusion." He gestured to Victoria's medal display. "Those decorations you see represent service in operations so classified that officially they never happened. For 58 years, Colonel Sterling has carried the weight of missions that couldn't be acknowledged, victories that couldn't be celebrated, and sacrifices that couldn't be recognized." Victoria remained at attention, her expression stoic despite the unprecedented public recognition. "Colonel Sterling was selected for the Studies and Observations Group in 1967, the President continued, becoming one of the first women to serve in what was then the military's most classified Special Operations Unit. She led reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory, coordinated rescue operations for downed pilots, and gathered intelligence that proved crucial to major strategic decisions." General Morrison opened the leather folder, revealing a decoration that made Colonel Hayes gasp audibly. "Colonel Sterling, by special act of Congress, and with the recommendation of the Joint Chiefs, I present you with the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as General Morrison placed the light blue ribbon around Victoria's neck. The Medal of Honor had been awarded to fewer than 3,500 recipients in the nation's history, and only a handful of women had ever received it. "The citation reads," General Morrison announced, "for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the Studies and Observations Group during operations in Southeast Asia from 1967 to 1971. Hammond felt sick to his stomach, the weight of his earlier accusations crushing down on him like a physical force. Reeves had gone pale, understanding finally dawning on him about who he had been challenging. President Richardson wasn't finished. Colonel Sterling's classified service included leading a rescue mission that extracted 37 American prisoners of war from a facility deep in North Vietnam, personally carrying 2 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy enemy fire, and coordinating intelligence operations that led to the successful evacuation of Saigon. The President's voice grew more serious. But perhaps her greatest service to this country was her willingness to remain silent about these achievements for nearly 6 decades, understanding that some victories must remain secret to protect sources, methods, and the safety of others who served in similar capacities. Victoria finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Mr. President, while I appreciate this recognition, I want everyone here to understand that I was never alone in these operations. I served alongside men and women whose names will never be known, whose sacrifices will never be acknowledged, who died in service to missions that officially never existed. She looked out at the crowd of veterans, her gaze settling briefly on Hammond and Reeves. The true measure of military service isn't the decorations we wear or the recognition we receive. It's the willingness to serve when no one is watching, to sacrifice when no one will know, and to carry the weight of necessary secrets for as long as duty requires. President Richardson nodded solemnly. Which is why today's ceremony is so important. For too long, Colonel Sterling and others like her have carried their service in silence. Today, we acknowledge that service publicly for the first time. As the formal ceremony concluded and the President prepared to depart, Hammond approached Victoria with visible difficulty. His military bearing was perfect, but his voice shook with emotion. "Colonel Sterling, I owe you a profound apology. We had no right to question your service, and I'm ashamed of our behaviour." Victoria's expression softened slightly as she looked at the young Marine. "Corporal, you were protecting the integrity of military traditions. That's commendable, even when you were wrong about the specific circumstances." "But we should have known." "How could you have known?" Victoria interrupted gently. "My service was classified above your clearance level. You responded exactly as you should have to what appeared to be stolen valor." Reeves stepped forward, struggling to find words. "Ma'am, Colonel, is there anything we can do to make this right?" Victoria studied both young men with eyes that had seen more combat than they could imagine. "You can remember this lesson. Heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and recognition. Sometimes it looks like an elderly woman sitting quietly in the back row, wearing medals that tell stories she's not allowed to share." She paused, looking at their young faces. "And you can remember that the greatest service is often the kind that